My name is Ophi YouTube Videos. I am a feminist and a lesbian. I make conversational commentary videos about both of those things, and this is the third one I have now made on my channel about the author Neil Gaiman and the allegations against him that were broken this summer. They were more recently reported on in Vulture or New York Magazine by Lila Shapiro. I'm going to get a bit more into that today, but first I do just need to lay out a pretty necessary trigger warning. We will be talking about dark and heavy shit. While I won't be going beat by beat on these allegations and the specifics of them, I also don't play by the whole self-censoring or using cutesy replacement words to try to get around things. So if you appreciate that I don't subscribe to that whole algorithm game, I would greatly appreciate it if you would consider subscribing to me. Thank you. Please go ahead and check the description below for my timestamps. The ones with question marks next to them you might want to skip if you're looking for either to skip one of my more controversial opinions about this, you'll see once we get there, or if you just want to skip more of the specifics. So check that out. We will be talking, though, about coercion, sexual assault, abuse of power dynamics, and things that come with that. You also don't have to have seen my previous videos for this one to make sense, but if you want to go back and watch them, I now have a playlist with all of them that's linked below as well. I'll be restating a lot of what I've already said, though, so don't feel like you need to pause and run. Like, you can save them for later. Obviously, this video from January of 2025 has more recent information than the ones from this summer do. Let's start with the Tortoise podcast. So, as I've already mentioned a couple of times now, the allegations against Neil Gaiman were broken this summer. They were broken in podcast format, a podcast that was partially hosted by Rachel Johnson called Master: The Allegations Against Neil Gaiman. It first told the stories of two different victims, but a third came forward after the initial batch of episodes for the Master podcast were released, and they put out another episode. There was also another victim who came forward separately to the Am I Broken podcast. She had recorded an episode with the host of that show and then asked for it not to come out. Following the Tortoise podcast's release, realizing she wasn't alone, she asked for that episode to be published, and it was published this summer. I went over that in my follow-up video, both her story and the other story that was added to the Tortoise podcast. I do want to say that I still reserve my criticisms for how the Tortoise podcast handled the stories of the three victims that it attempted to speak for, and its handling of the stories that it wanted to tell. But it does feel important for me to put right up at the top before I say anything else about this story, or the way that it's been broken, or about how much I prefer the way that it was written about in the most recent article. I want to say that the end result that this podcast clearly had of getting this story out there, and especially of bringing these women together, that feels more than worth any other gripes that I might have with the podcast at this point. Like, it is beyond being a silver lining. It is just a good thing. There are some things that I would like to acknowledge about the Tortoise podcast beyond just the fact that we genuinely could not have the reporting that we have now without it. First of all, and I've already posted about this on Blue Sky too, but I wanted to say it in a video. In one of my videos, I expressed skepticism over the way that the Neil Gaiman podcast presented Neil's position. I said that I thought that it was like weird and evasive phrasing because they were saying things like, we understand Neil Gaiman's position to be, and then saying something, and I was like, why won't they just tell us exactly what it is? I really didn't know what to make of it at the time, but I learned, and thank you so much to the commenter who brought this to my attention, since as you all know I am not on Twitter anymore, that the reason for this seems to have been just because of legal threats from Neil Gaiman. Paul Carano Galizia, the one part of this podcast that I do trust, he said on Twitter that Gaiman had responded in lengthy legal letters to the allegations put to him last year, and that each of those letters carried threats of legal action. And Rachel Johnson, the other host of the podcast, the one I trust less, also mentioned on her Twitter that they were unable to carry some of the allegations brought forward in the new article because of Britain's harsher libel laws. Again, those two things don't erase some of my other well-documented issues with the podcast, but I do just want to clarify, as I already posted about, that this thing that I had been hesitant about has now been adequately explained for me to no longer feel hesitant about it. It's a learning experience for me for next time, because if I need to listen to a podcast that is breaking a story and I feel like they're being similarly odd about the position of an abuser, I will now just assume, oh, that's a legal threat that they're not allowed to say is a legal threat. And again, I do not suddenly find Rachel Johnson to be a deeply trustworthy journalist. I still don't have a lot of trust in her, but I do actually have trust in Paul. And I'm also not comfortable with disregarding the value or the integrity of this and other Tortoise investigations just because of Rachel Johnson seeming to suck. And I do think she sucks. She has well-documented sympathy for various TERFs, and also, bafflingly, Ghislaine Maxwell. Rachel Johnson very well may have had a motivation in doing this and telling the story the way that she did that went beyond just wanting to stick up for victims and make their voices heard. But the end result is that no matter how much I otherwise dislike Rachel Johnson, no matter how much I feel like I can still hear the derision that was dripping from her voice in some of the parts of this podcast that she narrated, she did end up taking up for victims and making sure that their voices were heard. And I don't think that that or their voices and the stories that they brought forward should be ignored just because we don't like and don't have to like Rachel Johnson. As was pointed out in the comments on my community tab post about this article, Rachel Johnson, being independently wealthy, did not have to convince anybody that this story was worth telling. I'm sure she did have to fight with legal a bit to eventually actually get the story out there, as seems evidenced if they had to cut down some of the allegations because of libel laws, right? But to my understanding, Rachel was in a very different position than like a features writer at a other publication would be in terms of convincing an editor to let her spend time and effort chasing down a story. As I said in my response to that commenter, Rachel Johnson probably could have decided she wanted to make an investigation podcast into the process of paint drying. I just doubt she would have gotten Paul on board. But I do still think that there's much to still have qualms about with the podcast, and I have already had that conversation. I still don't appreciate its framing of consent, or the sort of scandalized way that it would like to paint any sex that hurts or causes any kind of discomfort as inherently being sexual assault, regardless of any consent to that hurt or discomfort. Like, I think it's extremely possible to leave space in a conversation about what it all means when somebody uses the guise of BDSM to be abusive without painting all such relationships as inherently abusive. But I don't think that Rachel Johnson or the guests that she had on her podcast were qualified to have that conversation. Also, I have not listened to the podcast again to prepare for this video. The Vulture article is enough. I feel like I have more than enough of my head occupied by this already now for a lifetime. But as I remember it, most of my concern was about how they treated the victims, how the victims' stories were told, and then also my other concern, I really didn't like how they spoke about kink or some of the implications that they had. I mean, again, just kind of felt like there was actual derision dripping from Rachel Johnson's voice when she talked about polyamory. But those were the only things that really registered when I had my eyes really, really peeled on the lookout for this being, as it was often described on Twitter, a TERF podcast. Again, Rachel Johnson does seem to have those TERF proclivities, and I do not like it. I do not fuck with TERFs. But this podcast, for some reasons we'll get into a bit later, got really commonly accepted to be characterized as inherently transphobic. And I think that's because it was a very easy means with which to dismiss it. I don't think and have never thought that trans people need to be super comfortable with going and cozying up to Rachel Johnson and listening to this podcast. Like, I was happy to listen to it and convey some of the details in my video, link people to other places they could read about it. But I've always thought that we should be very careful not to dismiss the testimony of these victims, that it was included in the podcast and was, up until this Vulture article, only available in that podcast. That's pretty much what my two first videos about this were attempting to convey. That it can both be a bad podcast that didn't do a great job and also still have useful and valuable information when it comes to these allegations against Neil. It also got really widely accepted for some reason that the podcast was behind a paywall, but it never was. It was always available wherever you get your podcasts, and with what felt like a pretty reasonable amount of built-in ads for a podcast that was distributed. I have thoughts about the conspiracy of it all, but I saved that for its own section towards the end. Again, I'm reminding you, you can check the timestamps if you want to be able to skip specifics, but while I am still speaking about the Tortoise podcast and what I mentioned earlier, and the details that Lila Shapiro was able to include that Rachel Johnson was not able to include in her podcast, there are some new and deeply troubling allegations in the article, specifically allegations that some of the sexual misconduct alleged took place in the presence of the child that Neil and Amanda share with at least 2 different victims. This is not mentioned in the podcast, and other than Rachel Johnson's mention of being unable to include things due to tougher libel laws, I don't have much information on why, but I think that that does explain it, right? I've already speculated this and also made clear it was speculation in my community tab post comments, but I do think that there's also a possibility that Vulture had an easier time making those allegations that involved the child because Vulture had spoken to somebody who was aligned with Amanda, who seems to have confirmed that it was at least a conversation between Amanda and Neil. Or it's possible, even without that seeming confirmation from Amanda's friend, that Vulture maybe was just able to publish additional details just by right of being in the United States, where it's harder to prove libel or defamation. But also, even if Rachel Johnson had not mentioned the libel laws being tougher and them being unable to share certain things, I wouldn't have thought that a potential timeline here where these victims might have shared a story or portions of their story with a more trusted publication on their second go-around would have strained my ability to believe them somehow. It actually feels extremely clear to me from the article that just came out that there was more time and care spent to get to know these victims by the author of this piece for Vulture. So if they had been more comfortable with sharing something that they hadn't previously shared, I would have respected that and completely understood it. But I do also think it's extremely possible that they have been sharing this entire story the whole time and it simply has not come out yet. In fact, I do think that that is more likely than the alternative where they had not shared it all yet, given that these women already have mentioned that they reached out to several publications and were told no. Again, Rachel Johnson didn't have to prove that this story was worth it the way that other journalists would have. I'm sure a lot of other journalists were simply unable to convince their legal team that this was worth the risk if Gaiman is out there sending legal threats like this to the Tortoise podcast. Also, for reasons that I won't be getting into, I am very personally and viscerally upset by the involvement of a child into this sort of dynamic, and my declining to linger on it here should not be understood as it being a piece of this that I am less concerned by. It is horrific. I understand how horrific it is. The police sirens outside do too, apparently. And now I need to pack it into a box so that I can continue to make this video. So we won't be getting into how and why this is horrific beyond the obvious, that it is involving a child in this sort of dynamic and that that is horrific. There are further details about how horrific that is in the article. You can read it yourself if you would like. This is a video of my cat. Isn't she very cute? I love her very much. Now, as I have already mentioned, I think that the Vulture article is just an improvement in journalism from the Tortoise podcast. There are a lot of ways that I think that the Tortoise podcast did badly and sort of informed, maybe trapped the Vulture article into telling things in certain ways or laying out maybe such specific, thorough details. But the article does manage, I think, to sidestep the worst of the true crime failings that I so hated in the podcast. And it does that by caring for its victims. Both the Tortoise podcast and the Vulture piece were created with seemingly full access to, for example, the WhatsApp message transcript history between Neil Gaiman and Scarlett, the young nanny. But where the transcript had been presented like an albatross in the podcast, like a thing that we were supposed to understood should complicate our ability to believe Scarlett if we accepted how it looks on the surface, these same messages are simply one facet of a much more human picture of Scarlett in this Vulture article. Since I first learned about her, I have felt very empathetic towards Scarlett, and even more so when I read this article. One of you, I think, put it best on my community tab post when you said that Scarlett deserved an article like this all along. I completely agree. I think that this article does better by each of the victims that it speaks to. I think it does a better job, too, at placing together a timeline I can follow Though I will say the addition of a new victim after the production had been finished and wrapped on the initial batch of Tortoise podcasts does account for some of the messiness of that timeline in my head, I think. But even other than that, I think the article does a much better job of explaining that just by way of not having been negotiated beforehand, the hand-waving away on Gaiman's team's part of some of these accounts of sexual assault as being BDSM just completely falls apart. I think this article's handling of what BDSM is and isn't is so much better than how it's handled in the podcast. Rather than bringing on an expert to argue that any sex that hurts at all is actually illegal, this bothers to make careful distinctions about consent. It is clumsy in the headline where they say non-consensual BDSM, which I think I understand what the headline writer was trying to get across, but it does feel like a bit of an oxymoron, and I don't think that there's a world where Lila Shapiro wrote that whole headline thing. I think that's somebody else's job. So I just really don't hold it against her. Also, in the article, there really didn't feel like nearly as much pearl clutching over Neil Gaiman and Amanda Palmer having had an open relationship. And as a result of that, and also maybe as a result of better access to sources close to Amanda, there's a bit more clarity on when that relationship was supposed to have closed back up and maybe didn't. And, okay. Speaking of the Vulture article having better access to sources close to Amanda. Okay, this is the part of the video that I know is going to make at least some people a little bit angry at me, so if you would like no Amanda Palmer apologia in your experience of this video, go ahead and check the timestamp. Meet me in the next section. This portion of the video may very well be for me, my best friend, and the two-ish other people who expressed sentiments that felt protective like I feel of Amanda Palmer on my community tab post. That might be the only group of people who are feeling what I am feeling right now, but I have thought it through. I still want to talk about it. I'm okay with that. Amanda Palmer is the most complicated part of all of this to me. She is the part that I keep coming back to, and the part that I hate that I keep coming back to, because this is actually a story about all of these fucked up things that a man did. But I keep coming back to Amanda because everybody else keeps coming back to Amanda too. Everybody else keeps bringing it back to Amanda Palmer. I swear, for every post I saw about Neil Gaiman this week, I saw 2 or 3 more posts about Amanda Palmer, and a lot of them were just mean. Some of them were accurate and also mean, but a lot of them were mean and also not accurate. So, some ground rules for this section, even though I can feel it in my bones that it doesn't matter how much I defend myself about this. People are still going to be mad at me. I know that Amanda Palmer has done fucked up shit. There is, in fact, even fucked up shit she has done in this article that came out about her ex-husband's allegations. But I feel about Amanda Palmer the same way that I feel about Taylor Swift. I hold no expectation for anybody else to like her or appreciate her work as much as I do, and if you want to criticize her, I will, for the most part, step aside and let you at her. I will probably also agree and nod along if you are being honest with your criticisms, and also you have enough familiarity with her work to not give it away that you maybe don't quite know what you're saying. But once you start being unfair, once you are hitting below the belt, then okay, let's talk about it. And that could be me bailing on a library book 2 pages in because it managed to misunderstand Snakegate so fundamentally that it turned Kim Kardashian into a hero, or it could be me taking a stance here that I know will not be the most commonly agreed upon one by my audience. But just like Kim Kardashian's Snapchat leaks did not actually prove that Taylor Swift consented to the nude wax model of her naked body or to being referred to as that bitch. And yeah, Snakegate's gonna be its own video. It became too big of a thing for How to Spot a Hate Train, so I'll stop talking about it now. But much the same way that the author of that library book I grabbed misunderstood that, and it made me stop in my tracks, I am pulled up short again and again by these implicit and explicit comparisons between Amanda Palmer and Ghislaine Maxwell. So I will say one more time before I defend her, I think there are some real criticisms to be had of Amanda Palmer. But as far as conclusions we can draw as actually given to us by information in the article, Ghislaine Maxwell, she is not. So something I actually stopped to point out when I recapped the podcast in my earlier videos, and that was then confirmed of the article, Amanda's now notorious 14 women have come to me about this comment, was not made in the context of either her or Scarlett understanding yet that what Scarlett had experienced was sexual assault. She seems to have been referencing affairs that happened after she and Neil had closed their open relationship. Women were coming to her about the fact that they had had relationships with Neil, not about having been sexually assaulted by him. And I'm not saying that it's even truly acceptable that Amanda Palmer couldn't seem to piece together until one of Scarlett's friends made it extremely clear that this was sexual assault. I think probably no matter what, I would think some level of criticism of Amanda here is fair. And I think especially it's fair given that so much of her branding, so much of her work hinges around her feminist ideals. And it's a failure to live up to that that she is just so unable to see it for what it is when Scarlett came to her. And there are also other parts of the article where it feels as clear as it has always felt in Amanda Palmer's work that she just cannot and will not see a power dynamic when she really should. I can point to that in her sleeping with a 20-year-old fan. Something I will tell you honestly, I do have a knee-jerk, ooh, yucky, why was she sleeping with a 20-year-old reaction to when I think about it. But also, she then unicorn hunted the 20-year-old over to Neil. And yeah, I do see it more as unicorn hunting than I do knowingly facilitating sexual assault. And maybe that's cope. I've gone back and forth since the article was uploaded about how confidently I can even defend Amanda here from the worst of what's being levied against her. But I have decided that with what's available right now in terms of information, I don't feel bad about remaining in an empathetic place towards Amanda right now. So whether or not it is cope, yeah, I think Neil Gaiman and Amanda Palmer were probably not as ethically non-monogamous as Amanda would have liked to believe they were. And I also think, as a lesbian, as somebody who has had to scroll through creepy looming unicorn hunting profiles anytime I was on dating apps, and who got annoyed enough to write many a pissy Facebook status about it, I think unicorn hunting is shitty. But also, I can't stomach agreeing to a conceit that to be polyamorous with somebody who you might be in denial about whether or not they would hurt someone else is the same thing as endorsing and facilitating your husband, especially ex-husband, sexually assaulting those women. And I think for a lot of people, they feel like they can specifically agree to it about Amanda without feeling as stomach sick as I do thinking about other women who have, been shitty and objectifying, but who shouldn't be asked to carry rapist levels of guilt for not having been the one who committed that act. It's far from impossible for me to imagine that the version of Amanda Palmer that Neil Gaiman thought that she was sharing, and I really don't like using that phrasing about a person, but I don't have a better one, so bear with me because I think it's worth it for this point. The version that she was sharing this young fan with, it's not impossible for me to imagine that she experienced a different version of Neil Gaiman than those women did. Because I think a fundamental thing, despite his attempt through his lawyers at using BDSM as an excuse, is that Neil Gaiman is not interested in somebody playing at powerlessness. He seems to be interested in the actual powerlessness. And that might seem like a contradictory take with my position that Amanda Palmer is also a victim of his, but I'm going to unpack that enough in this section for it to make sense, I hope. I'm saying this without making any speculations on what kind of proclivities these two had in private, because it does not matter and also is not anyone's business. I believe that the ways that Neil Gaiman would abuse his wife and the ways that he would abuse vulnerable young women are probably not identical. Maybe in terms of emotional abuse and manipulation, we could assume that Amanda Palmer experienced at least some of the same behaviors as his other victims did, but see, I struggle to place where this complete and total lack of empathy for Amanda Palmer is coming from, other than imagining her as cartoonishly evil. Because to my mind, either A, Amanda didn't know what Neil was capable of, or also she potentially realized at some point leading up to or after the divorce some portion of what he was capable of in terms of having emotionally troubling relationships with women, which is why she attempted to tell Neil to leave Scarlett alone, but she clearly wasn't conceptualizing him as an actual rapist yet if she thought that telling him about her lack of consent for him going after their babysitter would mean anything. And in that case, you really can't know something until you know it. From what I read in that article, Amanda did sort of course correct and begin to change her approach with Scarlett after Scarlett's friend literally spelled it out for her that it was sexual assault. And I don't agree with all of what Amanda did during this portion when she tried to course correct either. Telling her to go back to her parents is so Amanda Palmer. It is so unsurprising to me that Amanda doesn't understand what a horrific thing that would be to say to somebody estranged when we learn at the end of the article that Amanda herself is currently living with her own parents. I'm frustrated with her about that, and also, nuance, it was the best advice that she could offer, actually, because it is what she herself would have done. It just wasn't advice that was accessible or like an option for Scarlett. And the other possible read, excluding Amanda just being cartoonishly evil, would be that she knew what he was capable of, which, to me, implying that a woman who was married to an abusive and violent man knew what he was capable of, usually carries with it the implication that the ex-wife herself would have experienced what he was capable of. And yet, that's not really a possibility that I'm feeling weighted when people lob that Amanda should have or would have known. Again, I'm not speculating on what Amanda may or may not have been put through physically. I'm sure if she wants to tell us about that, she will. But if you're wondering why I'm so willing to call her a victim, despite my, solid lack of speculation there, maybe you didn't catch that last little bit about Amanda in the article when it's talking about why she's living with her parents now. Amanda Palmer and Neil Gaiman's divorce is currently dragging into its 5th year. I'm sure that there are plenty of divorces that take longer than a year or so because of totally normal reasons, but when it's people who I know have money and it takes longer than like a year, I start to suspect that there is post-separation abuse going on. And courts and custody battles are one of the biggest ways I am aware of that domestic abusers tend to implement post-separation abuse. I mean, there's this whole pseudoscience around parental alienation that, as I understand it, exists just to give a purportedly logical basis for usually men to implement post-separation abuse on their partners, sometimes getting judges to award full custody to a parent who has already been found to be abusive. And if you're getting annoyed with me because I was a little bit gendered there a second ago, be annoyed about how it's pretty much entirely men who do this. Despite the fact that it is a long known data point that when men pretty much ever even bother to try for custody, they get awarded to usually more favorable degrees than women, even before the rise of this parental alienation talk. But this parental alienation thing, which they should really just call it paternal alienation, but I guess they're at least pretending to be gender neutral about it. I guess it's kind of cute. Equal opportunity post-separation abuse. Also, I'm sure that this is a thing that a genuinely abusive parent does, right? Is turn their child against the other parent. It's just the people citing it, you know why they're citing it. They are usually citing it because they are a creepy misogynist who believes that men own their children no matter what they do to them. I've read some articles about this in the past. I'd love to make a video about it in the future, but it will take me a long time to get to. But yeah, putting out feelers right now. If anybody's read anything good about that or has an interesting angle they'd like to talk to me about it from. But anyway, it is relevant to this video even though I didn't let myself begin a deep dive on it because of that last paragraph that mentions Amanda, where it also mentions that they are in year 5 of their divorce proceedings. Amanda shared a statement to a similar effect on her Blue Sky and her Instagram, both of which she has had to turn off replies on, reminding everybody that she is in the process of ongoing custody and divorce proceedings and that she can't make public comment right now. She ends it with a reminder that she is first and foremost a parent and that she asks for privacy at this time. Which, sorry, girl, I'm making a YouTube video about you, but I bet I'm being a lot nicer to you than the other people who make videos about this will be, so I hope that at least evens it out a little. But I had already gotten there, because they mentioned in the article that the divorce was still going on. I thought about the kid, and I went, oh, no wonder Amanda dodged Tortoise every time they asked her for comment this summer, which was something I was already pretty forgiving of her for when I'd assumed that the custody was settled and she just had to co-parent with the man, but that I now feel a lot more empathy for, knowing court things aren't settled yet. I really think the reminder in the article and in Amanda's post that the custody proceedings are still ongoing is extremely useful. Another thing that's in the article that I thought was a useful key to understanding Amanda as a victim is when Neil's team tries to imply that Amanda is a main force driving this story of accusations against him. It feels like such an overplaying of their hand, of what I know must be just a barely disguised glee from Gaiman that he isn't the only one coming out of this with a wrecked feminist credibility. And it's an overplay because it doesn't convince me that Amanda is the one driving this story. There would be a Patreon exclusive concept album by now about him being a sexual abuser if she was. But it tells me that Gaiman is probably intentionally dragging this divorce out, probably intentionally dangling a custody arrangement to muzzle her for as long as he possibly can. And this is parasocial. This is admittedly parasocial. It is parasocial to the level where I keep examining whether or not I am being fair to Amanda Palmer or if I'm just giving her too much grace because I've appreciated her for so long. But it feels like torture that somebody designed in a lab for Amanda Palmer specifically, for her to be muzzled like that at all, let alone while she is being characterized as if she is responsible for facilitating the sexual assault of these women. Like, I am fully aware that there are many, many things you could say to and about Amanda Palmer that probably wouldn't even faze her, but this one is so horrific and feels so baseless and cruel that it hurts my feelings on her behalf. Same with people saying that they hope that the child gets taken away from both of them. I feel like that is just unimaginably cruel. I don't think there's enough information for us to say that, for us to root for even more destruction and devastation in this child's life. I hope this child can stay with Amanda. I do kind of understand how people get there from the information presented and from their empathy for these victims, how they get to Amanda Palmer being a Ghislaine Maxwell type. I understand at least a couple different routes people take to get there, but I do feel like I would be remiss not to mention that at least one such route is just, let's find a woman to blame. And I just think that there are other criticisms to be made, other criticisms that she deserves. Because I do have criticisms of Amanda Palmer here. I have always had criticisms of Amanda Palmer about certain things, and I've made no secret of that. The things that come up from this article, though, for me, are things like that somebody was always bound to get extremely hurt by her lack of distinction between friend and fan. Something I come back to again and again, I've already said this, by identifying publicly as a feminist and seeming to fail over and over and over to identify a power imbalance when it stares her in the face, Amanda Palmer pretty nakedly and openly fails to live up to her feminist ideals. And that sucks. I understand why that's frustrating. Not just the stuff we've already discussed, like the 20-year-old fan I think she shouldn't have been sleeping with, or even just hiring Scarlett in the first place, a young and vulnerable fan, as her nanny, rather than hiring a professional when it was time to replace the one that she and Neil had previously had employed. Amanda's whole deal is the whole, like, art of asking thing. She wants very badly to live in a world where it's okay to try to barter and ask for favors and let people give you things just because they love you and your work so much. And that whole thing falls apart when you realize that you're not actually on a level playing field with the people who love you and your work so much that they worship you. But Amanda can't see that, or she has to choose not to see that so that she can keep asking. I also think it would be hypocritical of me to sit here and act like I don't find it a labor issue that she and Neil apparently did not appear to make good on intentions or promises to pay their nanny until after the arrangement had already ended. Even completely setting the trauma aside, which I am loath to do, but if we were to say that that is a separate thing, even just not paying the nanny really sucks. It's a terrible look, and unfortunately, it's one that is extremely in character for Amanda Palmer given her past behavior. It's also seemingly pretty in character for Neil, given that lack of payment for services rendered seemed to be a through line with one of his other victims as well. This is another thing I said in my replies on that community tab post, but for as much as I could sit and criticize Amanda Palmer, even after having read this article, there are significantly worse things that I could say about Neil Gaiman, which is why I'd sort of like to keep the majority of my negative focus there. Like, for example, on his response, which he published on his website that had been dormant from this summer on, and I will read to you now. Over the past many months, I have watched the stories circulating the internet about me with horror and dismay. I've stayed quiet until now, both out of respect for the people who were sharing their stories and out of a desire not to draw even more attention to a lot of misinformation. I've always tried to be a private person, and felt increasingly that social media was the wrong place to talk about important personal matters. I've now reached the point where I feel that I should say something. As I read through this latest collection of accounts, there are moments I half recognize and moments I don't. Descriptions of things that happened, sitting beside things that emphatically did not happen. I'm far from a perfect person, but I have never engaged in non-consensual sexual activity with anyone, ever. I went back to read the messages I exchanged with the women around and following the occasions that have subsequently been reported as being abusive. These messages read now as they did when I received them, of two people enjoying entirely consensual sexual relationships and wanting to see one another again. At the time I was in those relationships, they seemed positive and happy on both sides. And I also realized, looking through them years later, that I could have and should have done so much better. I was emotionally unavailable while being sexually available, self-focused, and not as thoughtful as I could or should have been. I was obviously careless with people's hearts and feelings, and that's something that I really deeply regret. It was selfish of me. I was caught up in my own story, and I ignored other people's. I've spent some months now taking a long, hard look at who I have been and how I have made people feel. Like most of us, I'm learning, and I'm trying to do the work needed, and I know that that's not an overnight process. I hope that with the help of good people, I'll continue to grow. I understand that not everyone will believe me or even care what I say, but I'll be doing the work anyway, for myself, my family, and the people I love. I will be doing my very best to deserve their trust, as well as the trust of my readers. At the same time, as I reflect on my past and as I re-review everything that actually happened as opposed to what is being alleged, I don't accept there was any abuse. To repeat, I have never engaged in non-consensual sexual activity with anyone. Some of the horrible stories now being told simply never happened, while others have been so distorted from what actually took place that they bear no relationship to reality. I am prepared to take responsibility for any missteps I made. I'm not willing to turn my back on the truth, and I can't accept being described as someone I am not and cannot and will not admit to doing things I didn't do. I needed a calm down sweater. That is what Neil posted on his blog, the first thing he has posted there since it went dormant this summer, and it is just so clearly full of shit. I'm really confused by him suddenly claiming to be a private person. He was, in fact, constantly engaging with his fans publicly on Tumblr, in addition to the private creepy stuff we now know about. In fact, while I'm thinking about him being creepy on Tumblr, did you know that there was an entire blog dedicated to fans posting pictures of themselves reading his books in the bathtub? That it was created at his own expression of interest and then plugged by him, even though it didn't have so much as a mild minors do not interact in the submission box. Just really not the behavior of an author who I would let get away with describing themselves as private. I don't think you can be that active on Tumblr for so many years and still call yourself private. I'm also struck by the lack of specifics here. I have no idea what he thinks he is and is not admitting to. The way he plays into how people want to mischaracterize his abuse into something that was consented, the way he acts like this was really just an issue of him being careless with people's hearts. I hate this guy. Some other articles, at least one that I found, has also picked up some of this framing, and to be fair, they could be picking it up from, like, the Tortoise reporting as much as from Neil's own denials. The BBC's coverage of this story was bad. It claimed that the article states that the accusers all at some point, quote, played along, end quote, with Gaiman's desires. That's not phrasing that's in the article. That's a really victim-blaming way to describe what happened here. Again, though, it does tie into failings that have already existed in coverage about this, because people are just really apparently unequipped to discuss sexual violence that happens inside of the context of a relationship and not as a one-off interaction with a stranger. I also saw speculation from the Neil Gaiman Uncovered subreddit that the reason that the BBC article didn't mention the allegations regarding his child are, again, because of the stricter libel laws over there, which, much like the Tortoise coverage having to leave some of it out, I do understand. Mary Kate Carr wrote a good write-up of the Vulture report for the AV Club. I'm going to link that one down in the description as well below if you're looking for a good source for more of just a rundown of what the allegations themselves are. She didn't fall into the same traps that the BBC did. I thought that one was good reporting. The New York Times also carried a story specifically about Gaiman's denial blog post, and in it some of his victims responded. I again have to thank the Neil Gaiman Uncovered subreddit because I could not get any of my usual paywall workarounds to work for this. And then I found that somebody had already not only copy and pasted what the victim said, but also provided a link that does work. So thank you very much, and that's linked in the description below. The Neil Gaiman Uncovered subreddit has made keeping my eye on what's going on and also putting this video together as quickly as I was able to this week so much easier than it would be otherwise. So definitely go check out what they're doing over there. From that New York Times article, though, Kendra Stout shared a statement from several of them. A few couldn't be reached, responding to Gaiman's post. It read, "We are disappointed to see the same non-apology that women in this situation have seen so many times before." In an interview with The Times, Catherine Kendall, known by the pseudonym of Claire in the podcasts, described the culture of secrecy around Gaiman. Neil's works were his bait, and promotional events were his hunting ground, she said. As long as his publishers and professional collaborators remain silent, Neil will continue to have unrestricted access to vulnerable women. And one more quote from Kendra, "The silence of the community around him, his fandom, his publishers, is loud and disturbing," Stout said in an interview with The Times. "I've heard that it was an open secret that he was a predator, but that whisper network did not reach me." Also, I'm going to go ahead and slide in a portion of the video right now that I've recorded back in December for a video where I decided I just didn't have enough to say to actually go ahead and publish it. I was going over what I thought at the time looked like the entirety of the consequences Neil Gaiman would face as a result of all of this, but I'm not entirely sure actually that the consequences he has faced so far are all of the consequences that he's going to face. So I am just continuing to let that part sit in my drive, but I did still like this part that I had already recorded. The most high profile of consequences that Neil Gaiman seems to have faced would definitely be the rash of sudden cancellations of adaptations related to his intellectual property. These can probably be scatterplotted to varying degrees of almost definitely about the allegations, and maybe things just don't get picked up by streaming services sometimes. I'm extremely aware that shows, especially shows carried on streaming services, exist in a state of permanent near cancellation, and it is not a big deal when they get canceled. So it's extremely possible that, like, Dead Boy Detectives or The Graveyard Book weren't really going to go anywhere after the first season of Dead Boy Detectives or during the pre-production of The Graveyard Book. But the cancellation that is generally pretty accepted to be almost definitely to do with the allegations, because this was a show that was already in production and paused, is, of course, Good Omens. I have not seen Good Omens. I was, for a time, pretty interested in Good Omens, and then now less so. But I have heard good things. People over years have told me that they thought that I would really enjoy Good Omens, and then also in the comment sections of these videos that I have made about Neil Gaiman, I have heard from people who really, really like Good Omens. Good Omens is an Amazon Prime adaptation of a book by the same name, which was co-written with Neil Gaiman and also Terry Pratchett, an author who passed away in 2015. My understanding, and I checked this with my bestie who has read the book and also seen the show, so I'm not just pulling this out of nowhere, but also, like I said, I have not seen this show. My understanding is that there was a second book planned that Neil and Terry were going to write together that did not ever end up coming to fruition before Terry passed away. And that the plan for the show was that season 2, which already came out, existed as a bridge to a planned season 3, which would have been basically what the book that didn't get written would have been. Like I said, the third season of Good Omens was already in production when these allegations came out, and then that production paused. It was up in the air for a couple of months what would happen, what the eventual fate of this adaptation would be. But then eventually word came down that it would be shortened from a full season order to a movie instead. Neil Gaiman and his production company also stepped back, though Neil Gaiman will still get a writing credit on whatever eventually does come out. I've definitely seen a little bit of conflict about the responses to this, though I will say the Neil Gaiman Uncovered subreddit, which has been very helpful to me for keeping an eye on all of this, did ban posts essentially like complaining or venting about the Good Omens fandom and their frustration over the cancellation. Like I said, I did a lot of poking around on that Reddit for this video, and it was very helpful, so shout out to the Neil Gaiman Uncovered subreddit. I do think being disappointed that something was shortened from a full season order to a TV movie is reasonable, though, especially because I do believe, and I will admit that I may be biased, because like I said, a lot of the people who I've been hearing from who really like Good Omens, I heard from in the comments section of Anofi YouTube videos YouTube video, so they were people who very much did hold both the conflicting feelings of loving Good Omens and also hating what Neil Gaiman has done and who Neil Gaiman seems to be. My read on the people who I have interacted with who would consider themselves fans of Good Omens is that the affection that they feel for Good Omens is primarily tied up with either Terry Pratchett or with the gay angels that David Tennant and Michael Sheen are playing, and not at all something that feels related to Neil Gaiman. It does feel like a slightly different situation to me because of Terry Pratchett's involvement than like a full-hearted enjoyment of, say, this upcoming Harry Potter adaptation because of J.K. Rowling, right? Still, though, I don't blame anybody who doesn't want to have anything to do with this show now that they've learned what kind of a person Neil Gaiman seems to be. But I also, again, I do not blame people who have a complicated reaction to and feelings about this. I've heard from too many of you, honestly, about how complicated this is, and how it can be complicated while you're still having and showing empathy for the victims. So I just don't feel like there is an inherent conflict between sad about this TV show about the gay angels and sad about what happened to these women in real life. I've seen talk on the Neil Gaiman Uncovered subreddit that there is more reporting coming, and looking back at old posts, they were definitely aware that this Vulture article was on its way ahead of time, so I do definitely believe that there is probably more reporting on its way down the pipe this year. And as we have already learned from how things have gone so far, the more times that these stories get told, the more other women realize that their stories like this would also be heard if they find someone to reach out to. I would be far from surprised if this next batch of reporting features stories that we maybe haven't heard yet. And I would be even less surprised if once custody stuff is settled, something comes out where we have a bit more from Amanda's perspective than we already have. Another thing that I want to touch on here from the information we do have is something that I mentioned earlier. The insistence of a lot of people that all of this was a grand conspiracy from some secret cohort of TERFs beyond just Rachel Johnson, and that it was all to punish Neil Gaiman for being a trans rights ally. This whole narrative gave me pause from the start, just because it was a really great excuse to try to disbelieve the testimony that was coming from these women, but also because I'd never understood Neil Gaiman to be some amazing vocal ally. To be clear, I also did not understand him to be an outright transphobe either, but of everybody associated with Good Omens and who I knew that transphobes do really hate, if you said there was somebody that transphobes were trying to conspire against, I would ask you if you were sure you didn't mean David Tennant. Because David Tennant is in fact a vocal ally, and even then, even despite the fact that I don't think I've ever heard anything bad about David Tennant, I still personally would not leap to everybody accusing him of something as doing a Gone Girl. I would actually hear it out. But I do find the conspiracy angle especially interesting in light of the recent Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni developments. A commenter on that community post that I keep referencing pointed out that the conspiracy opinion could have been astroturfed. And my opinions about that are a little bit split, because yes, absolutely it could have been. It would take just one email or phone call to a PR team for them to go deputize somebody to go make opinions that had looked fringe on places like Reddit or Twitter look way more commonly accepted. But I also do think, given the connections that I've already outlined between Rachel Johnson and Turvery, that it wasn't an impossible stretch for people to make because they wanted to cope. So they wanted to not have to think about something that was going to make them too sad, and so they accepted what was a relatively easy narrative for them to accept if they didn't think too hard about it. I do want to say, I'm sure Gaiman's team was keeping an eye on what the defenses of him were and which ones were working, and that they also very well might have fanned distrust of and criticisms of the podcast, especially the ones that weren't actually rooted in its real failings. Like I said earlier, the lie about it being behind a paywall, or, that Twitter thread about the whole thing just being a nothing burger from that one guy who just so happens to only be interested in making content about Lily Orchard that he can easily monetize. Since, nobody else has bad Steven Universe takes, he definitely has to keep milking that lol cow. But there are also people who I am made a little bit less angry by, who fell for this to varying degrees as well, and I don't distrust them as much as I distrust that one guy. It feels important for me to point out that it's not even me disagreeing with the person who said that this could have been astroturfed when I say all of this. All of this is a yes and. Yes, this could have been astroturfed, and also they wouldn't have bothered astroturfing something that people wouldn't have fallen for. People who astroturf know what's going to seed. It's their job. So, I do want to conclude here and say, in conclusion, I despise Neil Gaiman. I'm grateful for this new reporting, and I'm also grateful that it stands on the shoulders of even what I do think is a deeply flawed original reporting by Tortoise. I think Neil Gaiman's insistence on himself as the victim in this feels very familiar. I think there are definitely further conversations to be had about the way things like the Tortoise podcast contribute to a true crimification of sexual assault allegations. I think conversations could be had about pinning down very specific and explicit details of sexual assault, and if that's more useful than harmful in a society that's primed like we are not to believe victims. But I don't think that what Lila Shapiro wrote needs to be my route in to talk about all of that, because I think that what she wrote was good. I think that it was empathetic and careful, and I think it was an article that was careful to get to know its victims because it wanted to tell us about them, because they are and were just as important as telling us what Gaiman is capable of was. I am horrified by what Neil Gaiman has done, but that is a feeling that I know that a lot of us have been sitting with since at least July. A new feeling that I have with this new reporting is a warmth and a gratitude for the fact that these women found each other, and a warmth and a gratitude for the women in Scarlett's life who helped to care for her and bolster her, and who helped her to come to terms with and find words for what had happened to her. I would love to hear what you all think about all of this. One thing in the article that I really could not get my head around is the participation of the couples counselor guy. So far as I can tell, that guy is not a licensed actual therapist, which I guess tells us why he's not scared of losing his license for being quoted about his patients on the record like this, right? I could have told you this guy was unethical back when we learned that he let Neil Gaiman send his victim to him to be convinced that she wasn't assaulted. But I am still really thrown by that guy's participation in this. His willingness to talk about both Scarlett and Amanda, seemingly, but then every so often remembering he should at least pretend at patient-provider privilege when a question about Neil seems a little too specific. I would like to think that he spoke about Amanda and Scarlett because they both asked him to speak about them, and that he wasn't breaking their confidentiality just on a whim and based on how he felt vibes-wise about each of them. Like I said, I'm really interested in this. My head is very stuck on it as far as the article goes, but other than just hardcore sketched out vibes, I cannot get my head around it. This would have been a more in-depth video, but another thing I mentioned in that community tab post I keep talking about, my head has been killing me all week, and I wanted to make sure that I had something to film once I had the capacity to film. So admittedly, we might circle back in the future to some of the things that I kind of skimmed or skipped over in this script. But I just don't feel a need to, or really an ability to sit down and read you that entire Vulture article and feel good about it. You should read it if you're interested, though. I'm working on a bunch of stuff all at once right now. I have gone ahead and let go of my ambitions to put that Lacey Green video out this month. I think that's going to be a February video because Baldoni's got a new lawsuit, and that guy apparently hates me just as much as I hate him, because this one's like twice as long as the last one was. If you do want to see the first hour or so of the Lacey Green deep dive and more as I keep filming it, you could consider supporting me on my Patreon, where I do post previews of my upcoming long videos and also a couple extra videos every month. Thank you so much to my Patreon subscribers, a few of whose names you can see on the screen right now. Patreon is such a huge help. It's a great way to help support me and what I do. I also have a coffee if you're interested in like a one-off donation, which is also a huge help. And so is just hanging out, watching my videos all the way through to the end, subscribing to my channel, liking my videos, all that stuff that you all already do. I happened to wake up terribly, terribly early on Monday for unrelated reasons, just because of all the pain. And I read this article at like 6 a.m., like an hour after it was published, and then, over the course of the next day, I was sent it, I think at least 5 times by the time I got around to making my community tab post about it. I've said this before in my Blake Lively videos, but it does mean a lot to me to be a person who people think of and want to hear from about things when there are developments. So thank you very much, and I hope that even though this was more of a snorkel level than a scuba dive, that this was worth wanting to hear. Even if you think I'm being too nice to Amanda Palmer. I love you.